My name is David Ansell, and this is my family tree story. Now, much of the story I'm going to tell you has been lost to the winds of history, but I'm going to piece it together as it's been told to me. Around 900 to 1,000 years ago, my family, who had been forced into the diaspora from their native land in the Middle East into Europe, were invited by the King of Sweden to come settle in an area of their kingdom now known as Poland. And for 900 years, my mother's family lived in southern Poland and did all sorts of things up until World War II. And in 1938, seeing World War II coming, my grandfather, who had escaped, went to Poland to invite his father-in-law to come to England. But my great-grandfather said, no, I'm got to stay here and tend my flock. And so that's kind of where my story begins. My grandmother grew up in this town. Her father was a leader in this town. It was a town called Mielec in southern Poland, not far from Krakow. And the Jews in this town were merchants and millers, and they coexisted kind of half and half with the other side of town, who were Polish Catholics, and lived that way really for 800-900 years. During the early 1900s, there was a pogrom in town. Imagine the invasion of the capital happening in the southern town in Poland. And my mother's mother was hidden in a closet with her 4 other sisters. And my great-grandmother put a down blanket over them so the children wouldn't get raped. But that left a lasting impression on my grandmother, and she fixed it in her mind that she was going to leave Poland. My grandfather grew up in the adjacent town, not far away, called Rzeszów, and his family had lived there for hundreds of years, and he was in the Polish army. And that was not a good occupation for a good Jewish boy in Poland at that time. And he routinely got the shit kicked out of him by the other soldiers. So he went AWOL, and he had to leave the country. He was 20, my grandmother was 19. They both wanted to leave. Now, in those days, your parents wouldn't let you go anywhere unless you got married. So my grandfather made his way, escaped to Antwerp. He was on the wanted list for being AWOL, but he escaped Poland, went to Antwerp, and my grandmother, wanting to escape Poland, said, someone wants to marry you, go to Antwerp. She walks into a room and sees a bunch of men and has no idea which man she's going to marry. But it was her ticket out. And they had a ticket to London. And that's how the story begins. They were the only ones in their families, pretty much, who escaped. And when World War II came and the Nazis came, everyone else was wiped out. So the chance, common desire of a 20-year-old man and a 19-year-old woman to escape the country of their birth, and they didn't care where they went, just needed to get out, that they married each other sight unseen, and it wasn't the happiest marriage ever, but their goal was freedom. And I like to say that on both my mother's side and my father's side, which I'll talk to you about, they were victims of the Nazis. Racism, mass incarceration, and genocide. Now, my dad's family, we don't know quite how to trace it back quite that far, but a kind of similar story. His family ultimately made it into Holland, where they lived quite comfortably in Holland, and the same fate hit them. My grandfather was 6 months old when his parents took him from Holland to England. And so he was in England, and then my grandmother grew up in England, and that's how the two of them met. Now, like most people who come off boats, we were assigned a name, and the original family name of my grandfather was Ansel, and that got changed off the boat to Ansel. And the original family name of my mother's side was Reich. And in England during World War II, that wasn't such a good last name to have, so that became Rich. But the story then, World War II happened. During World War II, some postcards showed up in England. They were thrown off of cattle cars by relatives who, and the Coast Guard said, we wish we were with these relatives, and those relatives were dead. So my parents grew up in England. The Nazis were 18 miles away. They were bombed during World War II. My father was in the RAF. And right after World War II, my grandfather got notice that he had a long lost brother in Newark, New Jersey. And he took the first tramp freighter out of London, went to Newark, met a brother who had run away from home in 1905. And my grandfather never saw him again. This was 1947. He came to the United States, came back to England. He was sick as a dog, went to the hospital, and on his dying bed, he told his children, you should all move to America. So that's where my story begins. I grew up in upstate New York. My parents were English immigrants to this country. We had on the surface what looked to be like the all-American family. We had 5 kids. My mother was a housewife. But in our background was this horror of the Holocaust. But in this country, I was assigned to be white, which was an amazing thing, because in Europe, I would have had a different assignment. And when I was about 16, I became acutely aware of the civil rights movement in this country and Martin Luther King. And I attended my first demonstration of that movement. And I couldn't help see the similarities between the oppression of the Jews in Europe and the oppression of Black people in the United States. And that sort of led me on my own personal journey of trying to understand what I could do and how I could do it. So that led me, I was smart, and I decided I wanted to be a doctor because I wanted to be able to give back. And that part of the journey led me to come to Cook County Hospital in Chicago and to be a doctor. And my story goes on from there. I've spent the last 40 years in Chicago as a doctor, taking care of poor people and fighting racism and economic deprivation. And that's my family tree story.